It started in August of 1935 when my father's mother was murdered by one of her lovers who got in a quarrel with another lover. I'll never forget the way it felt to hear my name, to be called. It was like to be wanted, to be desired, to be part of the group. So that sort of defined my life, that if you wanted to be close to other people, you did it through sex. And if you wanted to be close to other guys, you did it through sex. I know that today, as an adult, that was a way of grooming me or beginning to introduce me into a special relationship, which was highly inappropriate.
Welcome to Pure Passion. My name is David Kyle Foster, and I'm your host for today's program. Did you know that according to the National Institute of Mental Health, the typical child sex offender molests an average of 117 children, and that most of their victims never report the offense? Surprisingly, about 60% of male survivors report that at least one of their perpetrators was a female. 95% of victims know their perpetrators, and the median age for being sexually abused for both boys and girls is 10 years old. In surveys, over 1/4 of adult women and about 1/5 of adult men report being sexually abused as children. And since it is well known that men are much less likely to report their abuse, or to even see it as abuse, the rate of sexual abuse of males may be almost as high as it is for females. Today we're going to hear from the leader of the Hope Quest Ministry Group of Woodstock, Georgia, as well as from some of his clients who have lived through the trauma of childhood sexual abuse. We're going to hear what happened to them and how God has brought healing and transformation out of a very dark place. Please listen with your heart as well as with your mind, so that one day you can be a light of understanding for someone you know who has suffered in like fashion.
It started in August of 1935 when my father's mother was murdered by one of her lovers who got in a quarrel with another lover. And although I don't know anything about it much, I know that my dad was only 6 years old. And from that point, he was passed from family member to family member until he was 13, when he lied about his age to join the army because he didn't have anywhere else to go. And he was in the world conflict there, and as a young boy experienced horrors that no young boy would be prepared to deal with emotionally and psychologically. So he got wounded, and he was in the hospital ward with a father figure that he developed in the army, and he woke up one morning in a further trauma even. That man had hung himself in the hospital room, and so that sort of set the tone for our family life, which was severely impacted by post-traumatic stress disorder. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my dad would be just giving a blood-curdling yell from nightmares that he would be having. I can remember times when in the morning on Saturday when I would get up before he would, I would hide under the bed until he was gone, because you just never knew what life would be like in the home, whether Dad would be in a good mood or a bad mood, and whether life would be safe or not safe. I never got a chance to develop friendships with other guys. Every year we were in a different school. So when I was in the 4th grade, it was a traumatic year. I was 10. And for the first time, I was walking along the playground, the same playground where I was always rejected in the games all the guys played, because I wasn't good athletically, and I didn't know any of the guys because we had just moved there. So I was walking along the side of that playground one day, and a guy named Joe was sitting out over under a big oak tree. I was in the 4th grade, and Joe was a senior in high school. And there were a bunch of young men or young boys my age that were sitting around him in a circle. And I remember that as I walked by, Joe called my name. And I'll never forget the way it felt to hear my name, to be called. It was like to be wanted, to be desired, to be part of the group, because I was always the one that never got called. Back then, they call it soccer now. When I was growing up, we called it kickball. And I would always try to kick the ball and miss it, and everybody would laugh, and then nobody wanted me to be on their team. So all of a sudden, to hear my name, and there would be a group of boys there. So I walked over, and obviously I just, yes, here I am. I'll join this group, and sat down, and Joe was teaching the boys about masturbating. And so that sort of set the stage for me, for a young 10-year-old mind, that if you really are going to connect with boys and be a part of the male community, this is how you do it. I'd been trying for all these years and couldn't figure it out. Okay, this is how you do it. From there, most of the male friends that I had, close friends that I had, centered around masturbating. Even on through high school, pornography had become more prevalent. So that sort of defined my life, that if you wanted to be close to other people, you did it through sex. And if you wanted to be close to other guys, you did it through sex. So that defined a way of life for me up until the next stage, where I was about 14. I remember we were going to go see my Uncle Paul in Atlanta one weekend. And of course, you know, all I knew about Atlanta was Six Flags, and my dad had promised me we could go to Six Flags. So I was really excited about that. So off we go. Well, at the time, I didn't know that my Uncle Paul was homosexual, and that his roommate, Jerry, was also homosexual. They were just roommates. That's what everybody called them. So, you know, I'd heard of roommates before. So I remember being almost 14 years old, and we got over to their home in Roswell, and I was sitting up late one night in the den. Mom and Dad had already gone to bed, and Uncle Paul had already gone to his room, and Jerry came in with a Playboy magazine and said, "Here, I thought you might be interested in this." Well, I know today as an adult, you know, that was a way of grooming me, or beginning to introduce me into a special relationship, which was highly inappropriate. But on the same token, at the time, being a young male, I was very curious in the Playboy magazine. Who wouldn't be, right? So I took that and sat there and looked at it, and obviously became sexually aroused. And then the next night, the same thing happened. And then the next night was when I was in Jerry's room, and he came out of the shower nude and walked around and began to touch inappropriately. And so that set another connect point in my life and in my young mind, that, okay, so this is what it means to be close to Father, to close to other men. You do it through this kind of, what I can now say, sexually inappropriate touch.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion.
One of the things that I believe guys struggle with is, when do you recognize it as abusive? I grew up in my father's home. He was an auto mechanic, very successful one, worked on fleet trucks of Kraft Food and Wells Fargo and a lot of different van lines and stuff like that. Had a lot of mechanics that worked for him, but there were, back then, the NAPA parts calendars on all the toolboxes. I remember, you know, sex was everywhere, even in the shop, talking about sex. And so to be sexual, I almost had it in me that that's the way it's supposed to be. That's what it means to be a man, or to be male. And to be connected with Joe in that way it seemed right to me. It didn't seem abusive. And to be approached by Jerry later on, it didn't seem abusive. It seemed, on the one hand, it seemed wrong, because I'd grown up in the church and I'd been taught by my mom and my grandfather that, you know, there are things you don't do. But at the same time, everything about it felt right. So I would say I was well into my adult life before I began to recognize that it was abusive, or that it was something that shouldn't have happened. After my uncle's, after the situation with my uncle's roommate, life for me continued to center around two major things. One was a very close friend that I had in high school, that we spent a lot of time together in mutual masturbation and just closeness in that way. And then another friend where we spent a lot of time together going to adult theaters and watching pornography, which was, unless you had an 8mm camera back then, that's the only way you could see it. And every weekend or every other weekend, we did that for years. And that's probably what brought me to a level of conviction, of realizing that while I may not be performing in sex in the theater while I'm watching it, I'm viewing it. And that's an immoral thing that I shouldn't be doing. And of course, I had to later admit that the thing that drew me to that was not necessarily watching the sex, but watching the men in the sex. And that brought me again to the place where I began to realize that what had happened in my heart was the association that being sexual with men or desiring sexual with men, being sexual with men was really about feeling close and intimate in male relationships. And I had gotten that confused. And the pivotal point for me was when I decided that I wanted to be married. If you ask God to help you, He will. And it may not be in your timetable or in the way that you would want Him to, but God will always help us if we ask Him. And I'd fallen in love with who is now my current wife, and there was this great dilemma in my life about which way do you go? I mean, I guess that would be thinking in terms of, do I want to be what we would now say gay, or do I want to be straight? But I remember before we married, I had gone down to New Orleans, Louisiana one time for a job interview. And I had a friend that was with me who I had asked him to take me to a gay bar and just show me what does that look like. Because I had learned that term by then. So we went. And we went to one place where there was you danced. All the guys were dancing with each other. Well, that was cool. I thought that was great, to connect and to be with folks in that way. And then we went to another place where there were transsexuals, and I remember being overtaken, just exceedingly curious about that. And I was sitting at the table with a young lady named Stephanie, who used to be Stephen, and she had the most beautiful breasts, but yet she was in the process of having a sex change, and I didn't believe that. I'd never heard of such a thing. So I told her, I said, "Well, I don't believe you." And so she stood up and showed me, and she was very much still male from the waist down and was going through that process. And I remember that really disturbed me, to think about not so much that the change was going on, but that the confusion and the difficulty and the sadness that I sensed in Stephanie as I was experiencing that. And then we went to another place where it was just a gay leather bar. And that shocked me, because I'd never even imagined such things as what I saw there. But I remember going back to the hotel that night, and I just sat down and I said, not only is this something I don't want, it's not consistent with what I know about how God created me. So I had a real ambivalence in my heart about being drawn towards this, because I had learned this is the way you're close to men, and the father wound in me was so great that I needed that, but yet at the same time it was so inconsistent with the way I'd been taught in all of my upbringing as far as the Bible and what I knew about how God made us as men and women. So I just decided that night, I said, "God, I'm not going that way, I'm going this way, and I just need you to help me, because obviously there's something wrong with me that I don't understand." And that started a journey in my life. And I've been married for 27 years, and my wife and I are very happily married. And I can say that was the night when I was honest with God and said, okay, I'm making a choice, and I'm not fixed, and my struggle isn't gone, and my desires haven't changed, and my feelings aren't different, but I'm going to walk this path, and God, will you help me do it? And for the last 27 years, God has helped me to grow and heal and change, and to find healing and to find the transformation.
Your passion that beats for Christ alone. Your passion.
Several landmarks that I would say in my life would be, first, concerning the abuse, it's just being able to say that it happened. To be able to talk about the sexual struggle, and to talk about what happened. That's probably one huge thing. A lot of times today when I talk to fathers, I encourage them, talk to your son about masturbating. Talk to your son about pornography. If you have gained mastery over that, talk to your son about how you did it. How did you accomplish it? I wish my father had done that for me, but he didn't. And I think that being able to talk about it is huge. And being able to address the specifics of what I struggle with. I can stand up today before a group of people and say, I struggle with being tempted towards the male form. And I don't see that as any different than someone sitting next to me that also would struggle towards the female form. Men are wired to be sexually, visually stimulated. And whether it's through a female form or a male form, it's going to be something. And to be able to accept that and own it is part of my maleness. Okay, so my desires and attractions were disordered, and developmentally I got off track with that, but God is helping me rewire that. And yes, I do like the female form, but the point is that all men have the propensity to be struggling with sex in some areas, and to recognize that and be able to talk about it. Having trusted others in my life that I could say, hey, I'm struggling today with this, will you pray with me? Or learning to recognize the negative emotions and how a critique at work, for example, would cause me to feel inadequate about myself and then spiral me into sexual fantasy about being with a confident or another male that I perceived as being confident. And then the lie the devil puts out there is that if you union with that male sexually, you'll gain that confidence. One author calls it the cannibalistic compulsion. I can't union with another male and achieve his confidence or his self-esteem or his ability or his athletic prowess or anything he's got. But I can learn that my own feelings of inadequacy came from somewhere in my life, and that if I can be honest about that and ask God to help me with it, God will prove to me and help me find my own adequacy. If I do go and fall into sexual sin, instead of finding confidence, I end up being shamed and guilty or unfulfilled. I think one of the most horrendous things that I see today is working with people who have spent 10, 12, 15 years of their life trying to find certain things in male-male relationships and finally just deciding it's not there to be found. And then to have to deal with the regret and sadness that all that time has been lost and they still don't have anything. So I teach people today that let's be honest about what's really going on in our heart. Are we angry? Are we sad? Are we dealing with negative emotions? We don't know how to label them. Let's learn how to label them. Let's learn how those things are affecting our mood and our attitudes. And let's learn how it triggers our sexual fantasies and learn how to ask God to ask for the real thing, which is the truth about me, my abilities. I have the same capabilities that anyone else has. I have muscles, lungs, heartbeat, a good mind, eyes, ears, feet, hands. I can do anything, but it was my circumstances in life that taught me that I'm inadequate, that I'm inferior, that I can't do those things. Well, it's not true. I can do them. And unioning with some male is not going to make me more adequate. Learning to use the resources God's already given me will make me more adequate. And so we have to learn to recognize where those failures came from and how to ask God to help us move into experiencing that in any way. I would say that in the area of same-sex attractions, that's the one area you can't change on your own. Without a relationship with the Father through Jesus Christ, His Son, via the cross of Calvary, you don't have the power to change the inner core of your soul. Jeremiah said, can a leper change his spots? No. My maleness goes to the very core of my being. And if that is disordered in its sexual expression, I can't change that. God has to help me change that. And so what I learned over the years is that the affirming and accepting the intimacy and the closeness that I looked for in my dad and couldn't find, and that I tried to find in other men and it wasn't there, it really is in God the Father. And I found it through being honest with Him about how I really felt about life and our family and our circumstances and my struggle. I don't like me. To be honest with God that I don't like me was an opening of a door. Well, God, it was when I was honest at that level that God said, yeah, I know you don't like you. And you learned that from the boys on the playground in soccer or kickball. But what they think of you doesn't matter as much as what I think of you, and I do like you. And so that intimacy with God grew as I began to trust Him in ways that I couldn't trust my own earthly father. That process of learning that God was trustworthy is what took a process of years. And I guess I have to be honest and say I'm still learning about that. I may go to my grave still learning and overcoming, but I'm so much further than I was, and life is so much richer, and my walk with God is so much more meaningful and fulfilling. He's really there. He's really a person, and He helps me, and that's just something that I missed growing up. I know a lot of the gay activists would say that if you still struggle with being tempted by the male form, that you haven't found healing. They have a right to be wrong. I think that's baloney. I've been working with men for 17 years in the context of our church where I'm a pastor, a 17,000 member church. I've seen a lot of guys. In our ministry work that we do through Hope Quest, I've seen a lot of men. I do individual therapy. Here's what I know about men. We are sexual beings. If I put 10 men up here in a row, every one of them thinks about sex during the day. Every one of them is interested in sex. Every one of them would like to be sexual. Now, I know that I can't make a generalization and say every man's that way, but for the most part, that's the way men are. And if we talk about one man that's heterosexual and he's attracted to the female form and the beautiful woman walks by and he thinks about that she's beautiful, and he has an errant thought that, boy, I wonder, but has to reel that in and take it to Christ and not let his mind go there. Why? Because he's married. Why? Because he made a covenant with God that he would be moral in his sexual behaviors. Why? Because he made a promise, a commitment to his wife that he'd be faithful to her. And so, does that mean that he's not able to be interested in other women? Absolutely not. Well, so men have to learn self-control and choose commitment in relationship. Now, bring another guy alongside and say that he has the propensity to be attracted towards men or women. It's the same thing. Just because you have the ability to be attracted to something doesn't mean you choose it. So if you have the ability to be interested in the female and attracted towards the female and you marry one, you've made a commitment there. And what my experience has been is that as I follow that commitment, my desire for an attraction towards the disordered thing is minimized over the years, and it continues to fade and erase. And today, it's not even on the measuring scale compared to what it was when I was young. But am I going to sit here and say that I'm not attracted towards men ever? Well, that's not true. Just like it wouldn't be true if you took the most godliest Billy Graham, Adrian Rogers. If you ask either one of them, they both said it in the pulpit, they still have the ability to be attracted towards women other than their wives. It comes down to choosing the path you're going to walk and trusting God to minimize the other and choosing to live your life in the framework of covenant and commitment that you make.
Pure passion that beats for Christ alone.
I hope that today's program has pointed you in the right direction as you struggle or come to terms with your own abuse or that of a friend or loved one. There are, of course, many other kinds of stories and outcomes to having been sexually abused. Perhaps we haven't represented yours on today's program, but I want you to know that whatever your story, God is just as ready to bring healing to you, just as tender, just as wise, just as committed to leading you out from the darkness and into His marvelous light. Turn to Jesus Christ today. He's waiting to heal you. Give Him your heart and soul and allow Him to give you His wholeness in return. For Pure Passion, I'm David Kyle Foster.